It's the height of the Cold War, late 1950s, early 1960s. Alaska is a crucial frontier, remote, frozen, and strategically valuable. US military patrols are stationed in isolated outposts to monitor Soviet movements across the Bering Strait. These patrols live in brutal conditions: snow blindness, radio silence, and the endless Arctic night. One of these patrols, just a handful of soldiers, is sent to investigate strange disturbances near the border. At first, it seems like routine Cold War paranoia: tracks in the snow, faint noises in the night, equipment mysteriously damaged. But the deeper they go, the more they realize they are not just dealing with weather, isolation, or the Soviets. Something else is out there. Something massive, fast, and terrifyingly smart. The records from those years speak often of tension, of endless drills, and of silent nights where the only threat seemed to be frostbite and fatigue. But buried in fragmented reports and half-burned field notes is mention of a patrol, 6 men in total, who were ordered north along the ridgelines where the forest thins into frozen tundra. Officially, their mission was simple: follow up on unexplained activity reported by radar operators in the sector. Unofficially, the men whispered it was either Soviet scouts testing their defenses or something the brass wouldn't name. Corporal James Halloway remembered it differently than the paperwork described. His voice, preserved in fragments of his diary later found in a weather-beaten satchel, speaks of the cold first. Not the ordinary kind, but a merciless cold that gnawed through wool and steel. You stop feeling your fingers. The rifle stock burns against your gloves like metal left in fire. And the silence, it is so loud you think you can hear the blood moving in your ears. Halloway had seen combat in Korea, yet he swore the Alaskan frontier made a man feel smaller than any battlefield. The snowdrift stood taller than trucks. The trees creaked like bones snapping in the night. And above them, the aurora spread in curtains of green and white, a mocking beauty that only deepened the loneliness. The patrol moved slowly, skis dragging through waist-deep snow. At first, there was nothing unusual. Just the familiar hardship: frozen rations, broken radios, and the paranoia that every set of binoculars trained east might spot the Soviets staring back. But by the second night, odd details emerged. Private Larson was first to notice it. Tracks in the snow, too large to be a bear, too wide to be a man. They crossed their path in perfect lines, each impression sunk a foot deep. That wasn't human. Couldn't be. The steps were too long. If a man tried walking like that, his hips would snap. Sergeant Dawson dismissed it. Moose. Nothing more. Keep moving. But Halloway, writing later, admitted he didn't believe the sergeant even then. He had hunted moose. These weren't hooves, they were prints, broad, flat, with 5 distinct impressions, as if some giant hand had pressed down into the snow. By the third day, more equipment went missing. A crate of rations buried under snow was found ripped apart, its cans scattered and frozen stew leaking into the ice. No bear had teeth sharp enough to shear metal that way, and yet no alarms had been tripped. No sentry had seen or heard anything. It moved in the storm, Halloway wrote. We'd hear the wind moaning, then there'd be a shift, like something breathing with it. I'd swear I saw a shape once, standing on the ridgeline, tall, broader than any man in uniform. The men grew restless. Private Collins stopped speaking altogether, staring at the tree line with a pale face, muttering that he could hear footsteps just beyond the perimeter. At first, the others laughed. Then, one night, while the aurora shimmered overhead, a distant howl echoed through the valley. Not a wolf's call, not the bark of a dog. Deeper, stranger, almost human, yet stretched too long. None of them laughed after that. The patrol pressed onward, deeper into the forest, where the trees thickened and the snow seemed to muffle sound like a blanket over the earth. Their orders were to locate the source of the disturbance. If Soviet scouts were operating this far west, it had to be confirmed. But the tracks they followed weren't Russian. They weren't animal. They were deliberate. I felt it watching us, Halloway wrote, like eyes on the back of my neck. We'd march for hours, then find another set of prints crossing ours. It knew where we were going. It was leading us. By the end of the week, the men were exhausted. They had traveled farther north than their maps showed patrol routes, into territory marked only by jagged peaks and frozen rivers. The sergeant's confidence faltered. He no longer barked at them to pick up the pace. His face grew gaunt, his eyes always scanning the shadows between trees. Then, on the 7th night, it happened. Private Larson vanished. He had been on sentry duty, standing just 50 yards from camp, lantern glowing against the snow. The others heard nothing. No gunfire, no scream, just the sound of his rifle clattering against the ice. By the time they rushed to his post, all that remained were drag marks leading into the darkness. The men shouted his name. The wind answered back. They wanted to pursue, but the sergeant refused. "It's not the Soviets," he whispered almost to himself. "This isn't a war we know how to fight." That night, none of them slept. The disappearance of Private Larson was never officially recorded. The patrol log noted only, "Personnel lost during night watch, presumed separated during storm." But those who were there, those who survived long enough to write about it, told a different story. Corporal Holloway's diary described the aftermath with unease. "We stood in a half circle where he'd been posted, rifle frozen into the snow like he'd dropped it mid-breath. No footprints, no blood, no sign of struggle. Just drag marks, like something had hauled him backward with one arm." Larson was a big man, 190 pounds, and yet the snow wasn't disturbed as if there had been a fight. It was smooth, too smooth, as if he hadn't resisted at all. The men argued through the night. Sergeant Dawson insisted Larson had wandered off, maybe delirious from the cold. "Men crack up out here," he said. "Seen it before. You walk into the white and never come back." But Private Collins refused to believe it. His face was pale, lips cracked, and his eyes darted constantly toward the ridgeline. "It took him," Collins muttered. "It was waiting, watching. I saw it. I saw its shadow move across the snow before he fell silent." The sergeant silenced him with a sharp glare, but the damage was done. Seeds of panic had taken root. By morning, the storm had lifted, revealing a sky the color of steel. The men scouted the area for signs of Larson, but the drag marks ended abruptly at the tree line. Beyond that, nothing. The snow was untouched, pristine, as though the earth itself had swallowed him whole. They pressed on regardless. Orders were orders, and their supply caches further north meant turning back wasn't yet an option. But the silence between them grew heavier with each step. 2 days later, while crossing a frozen river, Private Anderson spotted movement on the opposite bank. Her dark figure, massive in stature, stood against the wind. At first, the men thought it was a man in heavy furs, but then the figure crouched low, the snow around it bending beneath its weight, and just as quickly, it was gone. Holloway wrote of that moment. "We raised our rifles but didn't fire. None of us dared. It wasn't fear of hitting an ally. It was fear of what might happen if we wounded it." That night, the campfires burned lower than usual. No one spoke. They listened instead, to the cracking of branches, the distant thud of snow falling from trees, and what sounded like low rumbling breaths carried on the wind. The patrol's supplies began to vanish. Cans of meat gone, even though they'd been sealed tight in canvas. A bundle of flare rounds disappeared from a pack. One morning, Anderson woke to find his boots missing, taken clean from beside his sleeping bag. He swore he hadn't moved them. Dawson snapped, accusing the men of paranoia and carelessness, but his own eyes betrayed him. The sergeant had stopped shaving, stopped barking orders. He jumped at noises now, clutching his carbine closer to his chest. On the 10th day, they stumbled across a clearing where the snow lay pressed flat, as though something massive had bedded down there. The size of the impression was staggering, 20 feet across, furrows leading outward in every direction. Collins whispered what they were all thinking. "That's no bear." At the far edge of the clearing, embedded in the ice, they found something else. A long, coarse hair, black as coal, thicker than any wolf's. When held against the light, it shimmered with an oily sheen. "We all touched it, though none of us wanted to," Holloway recorded. "It felt warm, alive, as though it had no right being left behind." That night, Dawson admitted quietly what none of them wanted to voice. "If this is Soviet, it ain't like anything I've ever seen, and if it's not Soviet, then we're trespassing in something else's territory." The 11th night marked the breaking point. The men had set a perimeter, rifles loaded, lanterns positioned to cover the clearing. The aurora blazed overhead, green fire licking across the black sky. At first, the sound came as a low vibration rolling across the valley. Then it rose, long, guttural, filled with a depth no human throat could produce. The howl shook the trees, rattled the lantern glass, and froze the blood in their veins. Collins broke. He dropped his rifle, screaming into the darkness, "We hear you, we know you're out there." Something answered. A second howl, closer now, echoed from behind the tree line. Then another, multiple, surrounding them. The men scrambled, rifles raised, lanterns shaking in trembling hands. The snow beyond the light seemed to move, shifting with shadows too large to be tricks of the eye. Holloway wrote his last words for that night before his pencil snapped in the cold. "We're not fighting Soviets. We're prey. It knows us, it follows us, and it's not alone." The official report claims the patrol pressed onward, though fewer details survive from this point on. Some suggest the men tried to retreat toward the nearest weather station. Others whisper that one by one, they simply vanished into the snow, claimed by something unseen. But in the fragments left behind, burned journals, scattered cartridges, torn canvas tents, one thing is certain: whatever stalked them was not finished yet. By the 12th day, the patrol was moving like ghosts themselves. Their uniforms were caked in ice, faces hollowed, eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights. Each man carried his rifle not as a weapon, but as a talisman, something to hold against the dread that gnawed at them. No one spoke unless necessary. When they did, it was in whispers, as though raising their voices might draw something closer. Sergeant Dawson forced them onward, deeper into terrain none of their maps marked clearly. He no longer mentioned Soviets. He no longer spoke of orders. His only command was to keep moving, as if standing still would invite disaster. That night, they set camp in the shadow of a frozen ridge. The lanterns cast long, flickering cones of light across the snow. Every man's nerves were frayed raw, but exhaustion outweighed fear. One by one, they drifted into restless sleep, until Anderson's scream tore through the silence. The men jolted awake to find his tent collapsed inward, canvas shredded as if from the outside. Anderson was gone. The snow bore marks again, long drags, leading toward the tree line. They chased after, but within 20 yards the trail ended, swallowed by untouched snow. "It doesn't leave tracks when it doesn't want to," Holloway scrawled. "That's the only explanation. Anderson didn't run. He was lifted, carried, and the snow closed itself behind them like water sealing after a stone drops through." Collins refused to stay another hour. He raved about shadows circling them, about hands reaching out from the dark. He fired his rifle blindly into the tree line, the muzzle flashes strobing against the snow. The echoes rolled through the valley like thunder. When silence fell again, the men heard it, not far, a heavy breath fogging the night, then the crunch of weight shifting on snow. Dawson ordered the lanterns raised high. Their beams caught something between the trees, two glints high off the ground, reflecting like eyes. The shape that emerged was massive, shoulders broader than any man's, its outline blurred by thick fur that shifted with the wind. It did not charge, it did not flee. It only stood there, swaying slowly, watching. The men froze, rifles trembling in their hands. Then, in the blink of an eye, the figure melted back into the trees, leaving only silence and the memory of its towering frame. They didn't speak for hours after. None dared to ask if they had all seen the same thing. By morning, the storm closed in. Winds whipped across the ridge, blotting out the sun and turning the world into a blur of white. The men marched single file, ropes tied between them so no one would vanish in the whiteout. Still, Collins insisted he heard footsteps pacing beside them, always just out of sight. "It was walking with us," he wrote in a scrap of his journal later found near the wreck of the patrol's sled. "Matching our pace, not in front, not behind, beside. Close enough that I could feel it breathing in time with mine." That night, the creature pressed closer. They heard it circling the camp, felt the vibrations through the snow as it moved. At one point, something brushed the edge of Holloway's tent, broad fingers dragging along the canvas. He held his breath, clutching his rifle, waiting for the strike. But none came. Instead, at dawn, they found Collins gone. His rope had been cut clean as though by a blade, though no knife marks were found. His place in the line was empty, the snow undisturbed. Halloway's last entry for that day was frantic, words scratched deep into the paper. It takes them without sound, it wants us afraid, it wants us broken, and it's working. Now only 3 remained: Dawson, Halloway, and Private Mills. They were starving, half mad from lack of sleep, and every instinct told them they were being herded. The trail they followed no longer felt like their own choice. The prints that appeared in the snow seemed to guide them north, always north into deeper wilderness. The men tried to turn back once, just once. Within hours they found themselves staring at their own tracks, circled back to the ridge where Anderson had vanished. It was as though the land itself was folding against them, forcing them into the creature's path. That night, Mills begged Dawson to fire flares to signal any nearby outpost. The sergeant refused. "We don't want it seeing where we are," Mills snapped. He screamed at Dawson, accusing him of leading them to slaughter, waving his rifle wildly until Halloway wrestled it from him. In the scuffle, the lantern tipped, plunging their camp into darkness. That was when they heard it again. Close. Too close. A low growl, rumbling like thunder across the snow. Then, the crunch of massive steps circling them in the dark. The men huddled back to back, rifles ready, breath fogging the air. They fired at the sound, muzzle flashes painting the storm in red-orange bursts. For a moment they thought they'd hit it. A roar followed, louder than any animal, filled with fury and pain. Trees shook as something crashed through the tree line. Snow sprayed across their faces as the ground trembled beneath its charge. Then silence, nothing but the wind. The men waited, rifles aimed at shadows. But the creature never emerged. When morning came, the area was devastated. Trees splintered, snow churned, lanterns smashed. But of the beast itself there was no sign, no blood, no tracks. As if the attack had been nothing but a warning. "It plays with us," Halloway wrote. "We're not hunters here, we're quarry. And it knows how to break us piece by piece." 3 men now trapped in the blizzard, moving north into a land that seemed eager to bury them. And with every step, the unseen predator moved closer. By the 14th day, the snowstorm seemed endless. The wind scoured their faces raw, and the cold had sunk so deep into their bones that even movement felt like dying slowly. 3 men left now, Dawson, Halloway, and Mills, though none of them looked like soldiers anymore. Their uniforms hung in tatters, rifles carried more out of ritual than strength, and the hollows under their eyes made them look like corpses marching on instinct alone. Somewhere in the storm they stumbled upon the remains of a supply outpost, an old weather station left to rot in the cold. Its roof sagged under layers of ice, and its windows gaped open like empty eye sockets. Dawson forced them inside. The walls groaned with the wind, but the thin shelter was still better than another night exposed. Inside they found remnants of the men who had once lived there, broken bunks, rusted lanterns, the faint smell of rot clinging to old blankets. Mills swore he heard whispers in the rafters, as though the wind itself was speaking their names. Halloway tried to convince him it was only the storm, but in truth he felt it too, an oppressive heaviness, as if the station itself knew what stalked them and pitied them for it. They lit a single lantern, its glow casting long quivering shadows along the cracked walls. No one dared sleep. The silence pressed in, broken only by the groan of timber and the hiss of wind sneaking through broken glass. Then came the sound. At first it was faint, a crunch in the snow far beyond the station. Then another, closer, slow, deliberate steps circling the building. Mills clutched his rifle, muttering prayers under his breath. Dawson raised a finger to his lips, but even he trembled. The steps stopped. For a long time there was nothing. Then a sound against the wall, a dragging like a hand running its fingers across the wood. The men froze, eyes locked on the wall, breath shallow. The lantern flickered. Through the broken window, Halloway saw it. A face. Not human, not animal, but something caught in between. A massive head covered in dark, matted hair, features distorted by shadow, but with eyes that glowed faintly in the lantern light. Eyes that looked back at him, steady, intelligent, filled with something colder than the snow outside. Halloway recoiled, his rifle clattering to the floor. The thing outside didn't move. It only watched, breath fogging against the glass, so close he could see frost forming with each exhale. Then, Just as suddenly, it was gone. The silence that followed was worse than its presence. Mills broke first. He collapsed into a corner, rocking back and forth, whispering Larson's name over and over. Dawson tried to shake him, but Mills's mind was already fractured. His hands clawed at his face, his teeth chattering words no one could understand. That night, sleep was impossible. Each man sat in silence, clutching his weapon, waiting for the next sound. Hours passed. Then from the roof above came a thud, heavy, too heavy for snow. Another followed, then another, footsteps pacing across the boards. Dawson motioned for silence, but the station shuddered as something massive dragged itself across the roof. Snow sifted down from the rafters with each step. Then the footsteps stopped directly above them. The lantern sputtered and went out. Darkness swallowed them. Mills screamed. His voice tore through the night as if something inside him finally snapped. He bolted for the door, rifle abandoned, throwing the wood open to the storm. Before Dawson or Holloway could stop him, he vanished into the blizzard, his cries echoing until they were swallowed by the wind. And then, nothing. The door slammed shut behind him, though neither Dawson nor Holloway had moved. They sat in silence, hearts pounding, the storm raging outside, wondering if Mills had fled into the white or been pulled into it. Hours passed before either man dared speak. "We're next," Dawson muttered. "Doesn't matter what we do, it's waiting for us to step outside." Holloway wrote his final entry for that night in the dark, his pencil scratching blindly on the paper. "We're trapped. We've seen it. It knows we're afraid. It plays with us like a wolf plays with sheep before the kill. If these pages are found, tell them it wasn't the Russians, it wasn't the cold, it was something else, something that owns this land." The next morning brought no relief. The storm had buried the station to its windows, and the world outside was a featureless wall of white. Dawson was silent now, sitting with his back to the wall, rifle across his knees, staring at the door as though daring it to open. The sound returned at dusk. Not footsteps this time, but a low rumbling growl that seemed to come from every direction at once. The walls shook, boards splintering. Then a massive hand, fingers long and gnarled, punched through the broken window, clawing at the air inside. Dawson fired. The rifle cracked loud inside the station, the muzzle flash lighting the room in brief bursts. A roar followed, so loud the timbers rattled. The hand withdrew, but the growl grew louder, circling them like a predator deciding when to strike. They both knew then that the weather station wasn't a refuge. It was a cage. The walls groaned as if the entire station would collapse under the weight pressing in from outside. The air inside was thick with smoke from Dawson's rifle, and the acrid sting burned their throats. Holloway sat frozen, notebook still open in his lap, pencil shaking in his hand. Outside, something massive exhaled, a long guttural breath that seemed to fill every crack in the wood. The sound of claws raked across the siding, slow and deliberate, carving deep grooves into the planks. Dawson raised his rifle toward the door, his eyes locked on it, as if expecting it to explode inward at any second. "It's playing with us," he whispered, waiting. Holloway wanted to argue, to say something that might keep sanity tethered, but the truth pressed on him heavier than the storm outside. They weren't soldiers anymore. They weren't even men on patrol. They were prey, cornered in a wooden box that wouldn't hold much longer. The door creaked. A shadow blocked out the little light that filtered through the storm. For a moment, neither man breathed. Then the shadow withdrew, leaving only silence and the whistle of wind. Dawson snapped. He stormed to the window, shoving the barrel of his rifle through the shattered frame. "You want us? Come get us!" he bellowed into the white. His voice cracked, half command, half desperation. He fired 3 rounds into the storm. The echoes died quick, swallowed by the snow. For a heartbeat, nothing answered. Then came the reply. A roar so loud it felt as though the earth itself shook. The glass shattered fully from the frame, snow blasting into the room as if the storm itself had been waiting for that moment. The roof timbers buckled under a heavy weight, dust raining down. Holloway scrambled to Dawson's side, shouting over the sound, but his voice was lost in the chaos. They fired together into the roof, as the boards above cracked, splintered, then gave way. Snow poured in. A massive arm, fur matted and dripping with ice, slammed through the ceiling, sweeping across the room like a fallen tree. Dawson was thrown against the wall, his rifle clattering across the floor. Holloway screamed his name, firing upward. The muzzle flash lit what he thought was a face, teeth like broken stone, eyes glowing with a dull amber light. For the briefest moment, those eyes met his, and there was no animal ignorance there, only recognition, intelligence, a predator's patience. The hand withdrew, leaving silence once more. Snow buried the floor, covering Dawson where he lay slumped against the wall. Blood streaked across the boards. Holloway crawled to him, shaking his shoulder, but the sergeant's eyes stared glassy and unfocused. Dawson was gone. The lantern flickered once, twice, then died. Darkness swallowed everything. He wrote the last words he ever put to paper in that suffocating dark, scratching them blindly onto the damp page with numb fingers. If anyone finds this, know it wasn't the Soviets. It wasn't a storm. It walks on two legs, taller than any man, silent as death, and it knows us. It chooses when to take us, it chooses when to let us run, and if you think you can hunt it, you're already its prey. The journal ended there. Months later, when a rescue team finally dug through the snow to reach the station, they found no bodies, no rifles, no trace of men at all. Only the journal pages, half frozen and deep in the timber beams, gouges too high for any man to have carved. The official report cited exposure, supply loss, and the unforgiving Alaskan wilderness. But off the record among the men who served the frontier, another version passed in whispers. The patrol hadn't vanished into the snow. They had been taken by something that lived in it, something that still lived there. And when the storms rolled over the mountains, soldiers swore they could hear it howl.